All right, so the next thing we're going to want to do is download this asset pack. This is going to be the art that we use for our game. So the first thing we're going to do is click download. You don't have to pay. You can just say no thanks, take me to the downloads. And we're going to download all 4 of these. Once you click download, it'll prompt you to download it to a location. You download it to wherever you want, and then we can close that tab. And as you can see here, I've exported all the files that we need. You can do that very fast by just selecting all the files, right clicking, and extract each archive to separate folder. And then from there, what we're going to do is select all 4 of these files, open up the project that we have, and we're just going to take all of them and drag them in. So once you've dragged them in, as you can see, I've already done that. Here, there are my 4 files. And once you've done that, that's it. Now, all we need to do is make sure that the pixelation is proper. So in order to do that, here we can see the pixelation is proper for the Godot icon. However, for you, it might not look like that. So to fix that, in our project settings, what we're going to do is we're going to go to filter settings, and then we're going to search up texture. And then we'll be prompted to rendering textures. We're going to unselect the filter setting, but now we have textures selected. Here in the default textures filter, you can see mine is nearest. However, the default is linear. So we're going to want to change that to nearest, or you're going to want to do that. All right, and now let's close that, and now we can see that it's pixelated, for you at least. And if it's not, we can actually look at the texture in each node. Each node will have its filter set to inherit. Inherit means we're just going to take the project settings, which we just set. However, I can change it to linear or nearest or whatever you want. However, I'm just going to keep it as inherit, or I'm just going to delete this node because we don't need it. Next up, we're going to delete the label because we no longer need that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to get started on our player and background. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our player first. So in order to do that, we have to make a character body 2D. So we're going to have this as a separate scene. The reason is because it's going to inherit this scene, and I'll explain that just in a second. So first, let's create a new folder for this guy and call it player. And then let's save it as player. So rename the node to player.scene. So if you're wondering what TSCN stands for, it just means it's a scene. Next up, we're going to add, actually, let's not add the script just yet. Let's look at this error. What does this error say? Consider adding a collision shape 2D or collision polygon 2D as a child to define its shape. This node has no shape as it can't collide or interact with other players or things. So that is true. We now have to add a collision shape. Here you can read this error as well. It's basically just saying we haven't given it a shape. So now we have a character body 2D and its shape. So here we can actually define the shape. We'll give it a capsule. We can zoom in and look at the capsule. So let's now add our sprite. So let's take a look at our files and look for our player. Should be in here. I'm going to look under PNG. I'm going to go to sprites. We can find player, and there we go. Now we have our player. And here we can see that we have a bunch of sprites. So here, now what we can do is find animated sprite 2D. We'll basically add a animated sprite, and we're going to go to sprite frames and make a new sprite. All right, so from here, what animation 2D or animated sprite allows us to do is basically organize all this. There's a different way to do this. However, we're going to be getting into that in a bit. So the first thing we're going to do is add all the animations we need. We're not going to use all of them. We're just going to use idle, run, and jump for now. Those are the 3 that we're going to use. So for idle, all we should be able to do, I believe, is just drag this in and drag and drop it. So select all of them and drag and drop. In jump, what we can do is just take all these and drag it in. So now we have up and down. And next, we'll go to run, drag all these and pop them in. The next thing we want to make sure that we're looking at, or one tip real quick, is if your sprites are sprite sheet like this, what we can do, so we have sprite run, what we can do instead, here, let's make a new run animation, or we'll do crouch. So let's say this is crouch. So if you have a sprite sheet instead of separate files, what you can do is go over here to this add frame from sprite sheet, select it, and find that's the house. We want to find the file that we're looking for. So double click PNG, sprite sheets. And now what we can do is, let's actually do the hurt, though, because we might actually use this later on. So let's zoom in by control zooming. And now what we can do is actually adjust this. On the top left, we have horizontal and vertical. So for our vertical, we only have one, right? For the horizontal, we have two. So now we can select both the frames and add those 2 frames. And now we can see here, there's our hurt. So let's actually change this name to hurt. Or we'll actually change this to death. So that'll be our death animation. Okay, next up, we're going to actually take a look at animating these. So to do this very quickly and simply, we want to first actually make sure our player can do stuff and move, right? So let's go to our player, rename it player, go to script. We're going to add a script. We're going to use the template that Godot actually gives us. This is a new addition to Godot 4, so it's very useful. So let's just create it. We're not going to do built-in. If you do built-in, the file will not save here. It will just be built into the actual node, which we don't want. We want the path to be able to edit it later on and look it up. So let's not have built-in. We're going to use the template and all this. Create. And now what we should have is a nice default template for our code. And now what we can do is go to our world. We can add our player by actually finding our player. So let's find our player, drag him in, and there we go. We now have our player. Now what we want to do is actually add floor. So to do that, we're going to add a static body. A static body is a physics body for 2D physics, which is static or moves only by script. So this is useful generally for 2 things, either a floor, or useful for walls and floors, or a platform that you might want to move yourself using code. So those are pretty useful things to use for this static body. And again, we have to add a collision shape for it. And for this one, it's actually very easy to create. What we can do is just drag the collision shape out, and that is our collision for the player. So we can now just save this as our floor. What we can do though for the wall is we can just duplicate this by saying Control D. We can Control D the collision shape. And what we have to do is make sure we actually make it unique. Why? Because what happens is if I Control D, if I duplicate it, if I edit this one, it actually edits the original one as well. So in order to change this or fix this, we're going to go to the shape on the top right and make it unique. So now when I edit this, it won't edit the first one. So now what we can do is duplicate this one and drag it over here, and that's our wall. All right, let's now also add a panel. A panel is basically just a block of sprite, essentially. It's just a block panel that we can actually draw with. This isn't a good way to actually make a floor. We're going to add a legitimate floor later on, but for now, this will act as our visible floor. So now when I play, we can go play, and here's our character. He's showing the hurt animation, but that's okay. But now we can walk and run, or walk, stop, idle, and jump. Awesome. And we didn't do anything. We didn't even look at the code. But now what we can do is go back to the player code and take a look at it. So let's go through this and understand a little bit. So first, we're setting a few variables. We have speed, jump velocity, and gravity. Gravity is essentially just the gravity default that the project is using. The jump speed is -400, or jump velocity, sorry, and speed is 300. Now let's take a look at the actual code as to what is happening. So physics process is a function that is essentially called every physics second. So it's called, I believe it's like 600 or 6,000 times a second, something like that. It's a lot. So it's being called quite a bit. And next, and it's passing through delta. So if not is on floor, we're going to do this. So what does this mean? If not is on floor, meaning if we're in the air. So if we're in the air, we're going to actually add velocity, right? So we're going to add velocity to the y direction. We're going to add it as gravity times delta. So essentially, we're just making the player get pulled down if we're jumping or if we're in the air, right? If we're not on the floor, we're going to pull them down to the ground. Next up is we're going to see if we're jumping or if we're asking the player to jump. So this is going to check the input. So input is action just pressed, UI accept. This is a default input that we'll actually edit later on, but that's okay. For now, we'll leave it at that. And is on floor. So we can only jump if we're on the floor. And then we jump, right? So this is how we jump, by making the velocity equal to -400. And this will just essentially make it -400, and then we're going to get pulled back down, right? Okay, next up is the direction. So what is direction? This is essentially going to look for our direction in the axis. So get axis, input.getAxis is just going to check which two keys are being pressed. If UI right, if UI right is being pressed, we're going to have direction is equal to 1. If UI left is being pressed, it's going to be equal to -1. If it's neither, it's going to be equal to 0. So if direction, meaning we have something, then velocity.x is going to be equal to direction times speed. So this is going to be actually moving us. Otherwise, we're going to be moving our velocity.x, so our current velocity, to 0 times speed, or using the speed acceleration essentially. This is basically going from whatever number we're at, so let's say like 400 to 0 in the speed amount of time. And then next up is our function move and slide. This is a built-in function that Godot has that allows us to move and actually slide along our floor. So now let's animate. So let's actually take a look at how we can do that. The way we can do that is by, let's add a ready function. So to do that, we can say func ready and let Godot complete our sentence for us. And then we can say get node animated sprite dot play idle. And we're going to play our idle animation. So make sure that it is spelled correctly, because it is also case capital. So if this was not case capital, it would not work. It'll give you an error and it'll tell you to fix it. So let's play and see what happens. So that is my idle animation. There we go. However, when I move, it doesn't do anything. So let's fix that. So now what we want to do, there's a few things we're going to actually do real quick. Instead of get node here, what we're going to do is we're going to set our node outside a function, so we can access this node everywhere. However, that's not going to work because, well, let's fix this error first. So that's not going to work because when I try to access a node outside of a function, this isn't really going to work because we want to essentially access it on runtime. So what we have to do is say on ready variable animation, and that'll fix it. So now we can access that animation node, right, which is this node, in a ready function or anywhere else. So now what we can do is say, let's say in the direction, we can say anim.play, was it run? I believe it was run. Let's double check what we wrote in our animation sprite frames. Yeah, run. So we're going to play the run animation if we are running. So otherwise, what we'll actually do is look here and we'll say idle. So if we're actually moving, we'll play run. If we're not moving, then we'll play idle. So now let's look at what we have. So let's play. So we're not moving, so we're playing idle. Now let's start walking. And as you can see, our player is starting to run. However, there's a few different issues. Now, the first issue is going to be the actual animation. And you might think, okay, now what I can do is say, okay, well, I can just say anim, play, and jump, right? And now when I jump, it'll actually animate my jump, right? So when I play, it'll play the jump. However, it's not. Why? Because what's happening is the physics process does not care what this animation is currently doing. When I call this function play, it doesn't matter if it's playing something else. It's not going to finish that animation. It's just going to play it right away, right? So what's happening is we're playing this animation, right? We've checked that we clicked jump. We're going to play it. However, what's happening is we're going to keep going down the code. We're going to see that the direction is either true or not. If it's not, that means we're going to play idle. If it is, we're going to play run. Now, one of these two is essentially going to override this. So there's actually a better way to essentially animate things in Godot. So what we're going to do is we're going to delete all this, and we're going to delete this too. We're going to keep this on ready function, and we're going to go back to our 2D sprite, and we're going to do two things first. So the first thing is we're going to actually add a camera 2D because our game is actually really, really big. So there's a few different things we can actually change the window. So the window is really big at the moment. It's kind of the default. There's a few different things we can do. We can go to the project settings. We can go to window, display, and we can change the viewport width and height. However, this isn't going to actually change the legitimate screen because this is just going to change. Here, let's actually test it and see what happens. So if I divide both by 2, it's going to essentially divide the actual screen. So here we can see if we go back to world, we can see the blue marker. That is our actual screen. So it's moved, right? It's gotten smaller. However, when I play, it now looks like this. So our window is a lot smaller. So we're not going to be doing that. We're going to reset these. What we're going to do instead, we're going to go to our player. We're going to take our camera. We're going to enable it, and we're going to zoom in. So we're going to zoom in maybe at like 1.6. And if you want to separate these two, you can actually click the keychain guy, and that'll unlock these two. So they're no longer linked. But I want them both to be linked, so we're going to just link it like that. All right, next up, make sure that it's enabled, and let's play and see what we have. So let's play, and now our player is looking a lot smaller, or it's actually zoomed in, and we can see our player clearly now. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually use animation tree and animation player. So in Godot, we have a few different things to animate things, where there's animated sprite, animation player, and animation tree. Now, animation player is a very good tool that most people use, and animation tree is a much more powerful tool that I like to use. So we're going to be going through both of them. For now, we're going to be using animation player first, and then we'll kind of transition to animation tree and see how that works. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go to animation, create an animation for each one. So we'll go idle, run, jump. We'll add the death one as well. Okay, so from here, what we can do is we can actually, there's a few different things options we have. So the first option is we can find our player. And as you can see, when we try, so let's say we're in the idle. So let's try going idle. And if I try dragging this in, nothing's going to happen, right? I can't drag this into our animation player like I did in the animation sprite. However, because the way the animation player works is essentially the animation player allows us to take a key or a property of something and change it over time. So what this means is if I'm in my animation, I can change the camera zoom. So if I go to zoom, I can animate the zoom. I can key this and then change it to another position over 1 second, right? So what we generally would do is take the sprite and animate it that way, right? So a good way to generally do this is have a big sprite sheet and just do it in that one sheet. However, we don't have that. We do have a few sheets, but that's still too many. So what we'll do instead is we'll use the animated sprite to actually do this. So the way we do this is actually a bit tricky in Godot. What we have to do is select the animated sprite. We have to go to animation, and now we will see the key. Now, if you don't do this, what would happen is if you try to select the animated sprite and go here, it might be a bit tricky to actually select the animation. So you have to select the animation itself from using the tab on the bottom, not the animation player. A lot of people will generally take the player and then select the animation player to edit it, right? So when I select the animation player on the node, I can now see the keys I can edit. However, if I try to do that with the animated sprite, it won't work because it's going to change the node that is selected to animation player. So what we need to do is make sure the sprite frames is open down here, and then move to the animation player, the animation, right? So now what we can do is go to animation, select idle, go back to animation, and then key that. So we're going to key this. We don't have to create reset track. So now we've changed the animation to idle. Now what we can do is we can zoom in a little bit. We can take our frame, go here, zoom in a little bit. We'll go to, we'll leave it at 0.1. We'll go up a frame, and we're basically going to manually animate this by going up a frame, and that's it. So we've put all the frames in there. Okay, so now what we have is the animation playing idle. So let's test this. Let's actually click this key, auto play on load. This will automatically start playing idle, and we're going to want to loop this, and then we're also going to make the time 0.4. So it's going to go from 0 to 0.4 and then loop. So let's play and see what we have. All right, we now have our animation playing idle. So we can still move and everything, and it plays idle. So it's working pretty nice. So now let's do that same thing for jump. Or sorry, not jump, run. Let's do that for run. So let's make sure we select our animated sprite. We go to jump or run, and then animation. And we're going to key the animation. We're going to key the frame. I'm going to go to 0.1. Make sure this next frame is selected. Again, next frame. And again, you have to do this manually and essentially select each frame manually. All right, from there, we're going to change this to 0.55. So we're going to go from 0 to 0.55, loop this. And then for the jump, what we're going to do is we're going to add another animation and call this fall. All right, from the jump animation, what we'll do is we'll take the animated sprite. We'll go from jump back to animation. One more time, we have to key this. Then we have to key the first frame, and then we'll go to fall, key the jump because that jump frame is there. We're going to go to frame 1, key that, and that's it. So that's our fall animation, essentially. Okay, now that we have everything set up, we have idle, frames, all that, we can now access all the animations through code, right? So the way we can do that is say, instead of anim, here what we can do is say onReady anim. Actually, we'll just remove this anim. We don't need the animated sprite anymore. So instead, what we can do is say animation player. So we're going to autoload the animation player and not the animation sprite. The animation player is accessing the sprite, so we no longer need it. So now what we can do, we're going to do the exact same thing. If in direction, we're going to say anim.play run and make sure that it's written properly. So we have run. So now we play idle by default, and then we can start running. Awesome. Okay, now that we've run, we now want to do the other animations again. So it's the same thing as animated sprite, but we're now going to just add it all in. So here, this is going to be idle. And then again, this is going to be jump. So let's copy paste that and just put jump. But now when we play, obviously we still have the same problem as before. So when I play, it doesn't show the jump, etc., and I don't change directions. Okay, so let's do the jump and all that stuff first. So let's think a little bit. What are we actually doing when we jump? Well, we're changing the velocity.y, right? When I move right and left, I'm only changing the x-axis, right? The x velocity. But when I jump, I'm changing the y-axis of the velocity. So now what we can do is essentially check to see if the velocity.y is 0 or not. If it's 0, that essentially means I'm not in the air. That also means I'm on the floor, right? So what I can do is say if velocity.y is equal to 0, then we can run. Alternatively, you can do not equal 0 something else, but I'm just going to do is equal to 0. So now we'll do this for the idle and the run. So now, I believe that should be it. So now what we should be able to do is check to see what we have. There we go. So now I can jump, right, stop, idle, and jump. Okay, now let's actually look at the fall. So in the fall animation, what we can do is do the same idea. However, what's happening with the velocity of y is here we set it to -400. All right, so we basically shoot it up, and then what are we doing? We're adding gravity to it. So we're going to start adding to it. That means we're going to essentially make the velocity greater than 0, right? So here it's going to be less than 0, and here it's going to be greater than 0. So what we can do is ask it if it's greater than 0. What we'll do is we'll play the fall animation. So now when I play, I jump, idle, and fall, right? So now it's going to see if I'm going down. If I'm starting to go down, it's going to start playing the fall animation, right? Okay, awesome. Next up is going to be looking at the actual sprite. So how do we change the direction? Well, what we can do is basically check for the direction. So let's actually take a look at this. So let's print the direction and see what I get. So, sorry, let's actually do this outside of this function. Let's do it right here. So we're always printing it. So let's print this. Let's play. So it's printing 0. If I start going to the right, it's going to print 1. If I go to the left, it's going to start printing -1. Right? So what I can do is I can do something with that, right? So I can actually say, let's say if direction, whoops, we'll say direction is equal to 1, then what we can do, or actually we'll do -1. We'll say, whoops, get node animated sprite lip h equals to true. So if you don't know what this does, if we go to our animated sprite, here we can now see a flip h function or a property that basically allows me to flip it. Okay, so let's go back to our script and add that, right? So now we also have to flip it back if our direction isn't -1, right? So we're going to have to say false if it's not -1. However, this is also going to be true if it's 0, right? So if I play, it's always going to start facing to the right. Now, if that's something you want, you can totally do that. Or you can just say elif direction equals 1. Then we can just flip it. This way, it'll just check for these two conditions, and then it'll just leave it on the other thing. So if I face the left, it'll face the left. If I face the right, it'll leave it on the left, etc. Right? So now we have a nice moving animation player. Okay, let's just firstly fix up the collision. So let's change this up a little bit. Let's stop the game.
let's go to our player and let's play our idle. By going here, we play idle. So let's take our collision shape and actually try to make it match. So let's turn off the grid. What we can do if you have this issue is we can lock the animation sprite. So let's do that and lock that. And now let's try to change the collision shape a little bit. Okay, there we go. So we now have a nice collision shape for our player. So now when I play, we now have a nice moving player on the floor that jumps and runs and all that stuff. Awesome. We've now created our player with animations and everything.